Today's video, I'm going to be talking about global migration and the inequalities, conflicts and injustices that are created through the migration process. For OCR's geography spec, part of 1.b, which I've highlighted here. So I'm going to start off with inequalities and move on to conflicts and injustices. Inequalities are where we see a difference between groups, and in this case, a difference between different countries caused by migration. One of the biggest inequalities is where we see many migrants who emigrate away from a country, and they are often the youngest people who are the fittest and most vibrant and able part of a workforce. If a country suddenly loses lots of those, so a source country will suddenly lose lots of young workers, then the economy can decline regionally and nationally because they haven't got a fully functioning workforce, and they're losing lots of very valuable labour which is going somewhere else. Obviously the people that benefit from this are the host countries. They get this young workforce that fills a labour gap and therefore can grow their economy. So this inequality between host and source countries starts to appear, a pattern which we will see repeated in other areas. Another one of those areas is the fact that these young migrants that are leaving, they are the most likely to have children, and so if they leave a source country, we see declining birth rates, population starts to age and shrink over time, while the host countries, they get these new migrants who are often likely to have children, increase that birth rate, stabilise populations, and sometimes even lead to population growth. So we see a inequality between source countries and host countries again. We also see that lots of these migrants are some of the most educated. They often leave for better opportunities. In the source country, that leads to a brain drain, so a lack of skills and skills gaps start to appear. The host countries, they get the skills because the educated people are going there. This means the labour gaps are filled and their economy can grow over time. Inequality again appearing between the two countries. We also see inequalities that can happen within a country. So we often see that families will send remittances back to their family members. And so the people that get it, that's a real benefit because they can spend money on new goods and services. That means they can have their living standards improve, but this causes inequality with people that don't get sent remittances. So other families that don't have people that have migrated, they won't be able to improve their living standards, and so therefore we can not only see inequality between countries, source and host, but particularly see an inequality appear within a country. Now I'm going to talk about conflict. One of the obvious areas of conflict is when we get a large group of people migrating to an area, if they decide to concentrate in one area, that puts a lot of pressure on the local services, housing, healthcare, education. And when that starts to happen, this can lead to conflict with the native population. It can sometimes be because it's actually a pressure, but it also can be a perceived pressure. So people believe there's a big pressure even if there isn't necessarily. We also get issues in terms of language or cultural barriers. The cultural barriers means perhaps people have got different religions or traditions between the migrants and natives. And if this starts to happen, migrants can often find it hard to integrate into that host country. In the worst circumstances, this can lead to conflict between groups, lead to really bad incidents of discrimination or racism and xenophobia towards migrants. So the word xenophobia, it means dislike or prejudice against people from other countries. And I've shown some examples here of because migration has happened to the UK, you start to see certain groups show this xenophobia, a dislike of migrants who have come over to the country, whether they be refugees or economic migrants. When we see this conflict happen in not just in the UK but other places where migrants have gone, we often see anti-immigration groups appear or far-right nationalist parties, people that push their kind of nationalist agenda, and we can see that in the two pictures here. Another area of conflict in terms of migration is border areas. They often become these sites of conflict because there is disagreements between the border authorities, the people that are trying to migrate, in this case between Mexico and the USA illegally, and traffickers. So they become these areas that are very tense areas because border authorities are trying to track them, the illegal migrants, traffickers are trying to get them across, and it often leads to clashes, this person here being arrested. I just wanted to show this graph to show you this is the amount of people that get detained on the US-Mexico border over the last 20 odd years, and it shows you that it goes up, but there's some very high rates. Thousands of people are trying to cross the border illegally, and that can obviously lead to lots of pressure on the US border control, and that therefore leads to lots of conflict if these groups actually interact. I'm now going to talk about injustices. We can see here this is a detention camp. So we often see people that are asylum seekers, they're applying to become refugees. They end up in detention centres while they wait for their processes to be processed, and they are treated poorly, often poor food, bedding and sanitation. As you can see, lots of people crammed in here. This is an example of a Libyan detention centre where people have tried to migrate to the EU and have been returned, and they are applying to be refugees, so they're in the stage of seeking asylum. So you can see that they're often in very, very bad conditions, so it's a slightly unjust way that these people are being treated. Another example would be that when migrants become so desperate to move away, they become vulnerable to exploitation. This is a very, very common problem. This is often where people take advantage of them. People promise them a safe passage and then end up tricking them and forcing them to do things. So we often get many migrants ending up being trafficked, where they're coerced into doing something, and therefore they end up in forced labour, some sort of sexual exploitation, sometimes end up in prostitution, or they're forced to do some sort of criminal activity for a gang of people who are controlling these vulnerable migrants. Here's some examples. It shows you that 1 in 3 migrants in Malaysian households actually are forced labour. We even get examples of modern slavery where people are allowed to migrate or given the opportunity to migrate by someone and then just kept as a slave. On the right we see that a lot of women are trafficked and then used in some sort of sexual exploitation, a lot higher than both men and children here. The last example I'll talk about injustices is that many refugees often end up living in very poor conditions in the camps. There are lots of examples here of rubbish and temporary shelters, and this can often be for years. And they do have some access often to sanitation and medicine and food provided by organisations like the UN, but it's not the kind of living standards that you would expect in a normal house or home, and so often this is a slightly unjust way that they are treated. And I've just wanted to show this example of a camp in Jordan that's been running since 2012. It's such a huge camp. It shows the size of the problem. We can see that all these people have got reasonably good housing to a certain degree, but it's not like a proper city. There's 80,000 people living here, and so resources would be stretched quite thinly for these people living in here, especially if they're living there for some people living up to 3 or 4 or 5 years, which would be quite an unjust period of their life.